very warm welcome, everyone, to our second peer learning session. Today's session is on applying risk insights in resilient development and adaptation planning. We've got a great set of both speakers for this session, but we're also going to be doing some smaller group discussions. So that's two things really to look forward to in this session. Now, I'd love to get started with a little activity. And, one of the things that was really clear to me in our last session was there is a tremendous amount of diversity in the participants and all of you who have joined us. And so what I'd like to start with is something in the chat. I'd love to hear from each of you, what is the best local food from your country? So go ahead and tell us what that food is in the chat and tell us what it's made from, right? So what is the best local food from your country? What is it? And what is it made from? Go ahead and tell us in the chat. I'm going to be looking at that. I want to see what are some of the diverse answers that we get around this. Okay, so good to see those. Thanks for sharing, everyone. And I guess it makes sense considering we are coming up to lunch, I think, for some of you. So just as we get this session started, I have a few reminders. Number one, do keep your microphone muted during the session, or at least during the presentations. If you have questions, feel free to send them into the chat at any point. And what you can also do is you can raise your hand for questions. And so if you click the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see the raise hand button there. And we're going to have some opportunities for some Q&A and for some discussion in today's session. Now, the learning sessions are part of this broader program, the Pacific Disaster Risk Knowledge Series on disaster risk knowledge in the Pacific, vital information for resilient development. And that is an event that is hosted by ADB and the Pacific community. The peer learning sessions are really an opportunity for Pacific government staff, regional experts, and users of climate and disaster risk information to network and to learn from each other. So that's all of you who have joined us in this session. And once again, participants who complete the program will receive a certificate. So today, this is session 2 of 3. So we have one more session that is coming up, but this is our second session. Now, session 2 will focus on the application of risk information in decision-making. So last session was really an overview. This session, we're going to go deeper into some of the applications that we're seeing some interesting case studies around that. And we're also going to be looking at where do Pacific Island countries stand in terms of the mechanisms that they have for collecting and making use of risk information, and what are some of our opportunities for moving forward. And that's going to be a point of discussion for today. Now, in our agenda, what we're going to start with is a panel discussion on the value of risk information in decision-making. We have 4 people who are joining us for this panel. We're going to hear short presentations from each of them. That will be followed by some reflections and questions. And then we're going to have a breakout discussion on mechanisms for collecting and using risk information. And so we'll be coming together in small groups of 4 or 5 people to do that. And then we'll hear from all of those groups and we'll do a wrap up. So that's a little bit of what the next hour and a half will look like. What I'd like to do is pass things over to Alexandra Galperin, who is a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with the Pacific Regional Department at ADB. And Alexandra will be moderating the next few pieces of today's session. Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carl, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody who's joined us, where we're happy to see everybody again after the first event. So before we go really into the centerpiece of today's event, that is the panel discussion with 4 distinguished panelists, I would like you to take 2 minutes to reflect about any questions you may have in relation to risk information and investment planning, risk information and or for adaptation, and the risk information needs and for resilient recovery and in general for the private sector. So those 3, if you can take 2 minutes, any questions you may have, you can also continue thinking about that and adding these questions, and we'll come back to these after the panel discussion. In the meantime, I would like to introduce our panelists, and we're really very lucky to have 4 panelists who join us from very different organizations, join us from different countries, and with a different set of expertise. Let me first welcome the Permanent Secretary for Rural and Maritime Development and Disaster Management, David Kolitagane, who joins us from Fiji. David Kolitagane has a very long and distinguished career in Fiji's public service, as well as in international public service. Amongst many positions, he's served as the Permanent Secretary for Public Enterprises, Infrastructure, Transport, Agriculture, and Economy. And I may leave something out here, I'm not quite sure. Mr. Kolitagane also served as the senior advisor to the executive director of the Southeast Asia Department in the World Bank for 2 years. So David really joins us with a very good background in economics, expertise in finance and investment, and project management locally and abroad. And we'll be hearing later from him on Fiji's approach to pursuing risk-informed development and resilience. The second panelist who I'd like to welcome is Philomena Nelson. She's the Climate Change Advisor at the Secretariat of the Regional Environmental Program, joining us from Fiji as well, I believe. Philomena is the former Assistant CEO of the Samoan National Disaster Management Organization, and she has direct experience of large-scale disasters, including the 2009 Pacific tsunami that many of you will remember, as well as 2012 cyclone even. So welcome, Philomena. And next is James Miyazoe II. He is a project manager at the Project Management Unit of the Ministry of Works, Infrastructure and Utilities of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And he has a master's in global environmental studies from the University of Sofia in Japan. Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Rebecca Tavioni, and she is the CEO of the Cook Islands Chamber of Commerce. Before that, Rebecca has had a long career in the private sector and has held different positions in New Zealand in various industries. So she's looking at these issues she will talk about from many perspectives. So these included private health insurance, electronics, telecom, and she actually started her career in telecom industry in Avarua. But without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to the Permanent Secretary, David Kolitagane, to talk about Fiji's approach to resilient development. Permanent Secretary, the floor is yours.
And panel members, colleagues who are joining from the Pacific and in Asia, Bula Vinaka from Fiji. It's quite an honor for me to be part of the panel discussion this morning. A very important topic, not only for Fiji but the Pacific Islands, and I think globally, this is a critical theme that affects both in terms of the disaster that we continually face, both the frequency and the intensity of disasters, and it's now part of our development agenda, basically. First, let me highlight a few reasons why resilient development and adaptation planning is critical, especially for small island states. Pacific Islands are among the most exposed vulnerable in the world in terms of disaster and climate risk. This has been well documented in a lot of research and recent studies, reports from development partners. And risks continue to escalate and have big negative impacts on the economy and livelihoods of people. Every year, 10,000 of people across the region are pushed into poverty as a result of disaster. in Fiji alone, an average of 3% of our population are pushed back into below poverty line yearly due to disaster, to the impact of disaster and climate change. So in the past 10 years alone, Fiji experienced 14 cyclones, cascading hazard amounts to about $3 billion in damages and 67 fatalities. So these are significant statistics that show the impact that goes from the global macro economy to the civilian life and our citizens. So basically, a quarter of our population in Fiji moved back into poverty annually, based on climate and the impact of climate change and disaster, especially disaster. We spent 6 months of our operation. Fortunately, I'm now being positioned as part of my portfolio, managing disaster during our disaster operation. Disaster operations in Fiji is consuming 50% of the financial year, or that half of the time of where we plan and where we develop projects. Nearly 50% of the time we spend on planning and executing during disaster period, from November to April. So it's a big time and a lot of resources that we need to spend. I think moving forward, it's only fair that we as small island states map out a more smart strategy, a more resilient planning platform that adapts, or that will cushion our people given these huge impacts or the devastation. Very quickly, I think Fiji's approach have been both top down from legislation. Our approach, I can explain it in a very simple format, is coming from top legislative level, policy, and also at the same time we are approaching it from project community level going up. A dual multi-pronged approach that we see is working for us at the moment. For example, in 2021 September, we passed in Parliament the Climate Change Act in 2021. This act, this legislation basically demands all agencies, all government agencies, and all, including the private sector, to start including risk assessments into building infrastructure and the assets. And it's now legislated, and it's a mandated planning tool. In 2018, we also Fiji created its first ever national adaptation plan. It's a strategy that we try to demonstrate adaptation efforts across various agencies to has a vision of Fiji's development towards a more climate resilient nation. Our national disaster risk reduction policy was approved and launched by the Prime Minister back in 2019. This policy, again, follows on from a national whole of government, whole of society approach to inculcate or to embed risk planning and risk reduction in terms of developing project solutions, both, especially at community level. Fiji, the most devastating Category 5 cyclone hit Fiji in 2016, wiped out nearly a third of our GDP. Cyclone Winston, and over 40 fatalities. We learned a lot from that event, and now I think what the government is doing now is really embed risk reduction policies, from policies to SOPs and even at project level. I'm happy to, I come down to my last point. At the moment, we work, fortunately, and I thank our development partners, including our bilateral partners, in working with the ministry. Last year, we developed and we finalized and adopted a development plan for rural and maritime sector in Fiji last year. So again, risk and community resilience was a core theme of this 10-year plan for rural and maritime sector. In this plan, we adopted a risk assessment mechanism to start informing all the projects that the ministry does comes through a vetting process that outlines its layers of risk at the community level, at project level, that we need to fund. What we're finding now is very interesting. 50% of our projects we need to top up because of the cost of risks that we identified. 30 to 60% of our cost, of our project cost, have to be added on because of this risk assessment and vulnerabilities that we've identified. And it's an interesting space for us. We're still learning and we're doing. Fortunately, through UNDP Gulf Forest Program, we've adopted these planning tools that goes down to project to community level to start amplifying and to redefine how Fiji can implement better risk resilient projects at the community level. I think I'll leave it there, Alexander and MC. Thank you for allowing me to explain and to highlight some of the experiences that we have here in Fiji.
Yeah, thank you so much, Permanent Secretary, for this great overview of the situation in Fiji, first to start with, in terms of the level of risk and what you're dealing with on an annual basis and over a decade and beyond, but also highlighting some of the mechanisms and the measures that you have taken to integrate risk and actually risk information and risk assessment at the project level, at the policy level. I think the figure you gave of 30 to 50% of projects that are found after the risk vetting process needing some sort of topping up and further investment is really telling, and I think an excellent introduction to our panel. So thank you so much. I would like to go to the next speaker. And this is James Miyazoa II. He's going to talk about using improved disaster risk information for the design of an adaptation investment. James, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sandra, and hello to all the panelists and the participants. Let me just share my presentation. So I prepared a short presentation since I'm more of a visual learner. So I'll be presenting on the eBay coastal protection, which is one of our projects here in the Marshall Islands. And the focus is really on how we use these risk tools as well as science to look into how we can design these seawalls and other stuff. So just a quick background, this project is under the PREP2 project, which is funded by the World Bank. And the main issue behind it is that the Marshall Islands is really vulnerable to these coastal hazards such as king tides, typhoons, or sea level rise. And we had a recent typhoon in 2015, which really exposed the vulnerability of the Marshall Islands because of our socioeconomic limits as well as our geographical constraints. I mean, we're basically just 2 meters above sea level rise, so we're very exposed and vulnerable to climate change. So this project really fills in that gap, and part of the component of the PREP2 project is to design and construct the seawall in Ibay, which is one of the most populated islands here in the Marshall Islands. And so since the focus of this event is really on risk information and risk assessment, part of this project is to look at how we understand the current and future risk for Ibay. We did a coastal risk assessment in Ibay, and some of the data that we got from it is what are the exposures? For example, what are the buildings we have, the assets, and how are they classified? What are the values of these assets? And then looking into what are the estimated annual damages, as well as the losses that we get if there was a hazard to these assets, and how much can we lose in our economy or our financial constraints. And also part of it was the coastal vulnerability assessment. And this study really brought a lot of data that we needed, such as how we're performing against these extreme waves, extreme weather conditions, how much damage are these typhoons and these sea level rise, erosions, all these disasters are affecting our islands. And also part of the study, we got some hydrodynamic data, such as the tide levels, the sea level rise, wave heights, erosion, crest levels, wave heights, all these data that we really need in order to make the decision on how we will design our coastal protection, which is I'll go into the next slide. So I won't really go into details on these designs, but based on the studies that we had, and there were also other studies we did, such as LiDAR surveys or aggregate studies. So we started with 5 designs and sort of break it down into 3 semifinal designs. And just to give what these final designs are, they are 2 of them are concrete blocks, or more of like a seawall. And then the last one is a reef flat breakwater with shoreline revetment. So these were the final designs that we came up with, and using the data that we received from the coastal vulnerability assessment, we wanted to know how will these designs perform when we actually construct it in Ibay, and how will the disasters and the hazards affect these designs? Will they be able to even perform well during disaster events? So one of the way that we tested these designs is using the physical wave modeling. And this was conducted in a laboratory in Sydney, Australia. So we used this model to sort of calibrate the machine to simulate the actual hazards that we have in Ibay, and while installing or constructing a smaller version of our designs. So this is just one of the examples of the testing, and it's the concrete seawall. And I believe this testing was to simulate a swell wave and see how will the seawall perform. Will there be overtopping? Will it have structural integrity against these waves? And basically from the results is that there were little overtopping and less damage if there was a swell event in Ibay. And this was another testing we did. This is the 3rd design, which is the shoreline revetment. And not to go really into the scientific details and the technical, but based on the results we had, this had a lot more overtopping. So we would expect more overtopping on Ibay if we use this design. But unlike the previous ones, there was little damage. So if we imagine it constructing the design in Ibay, we could see that based on the risk and how the hydrodynamic conditions are in Ibay, this design would be able to have the structural integrity against the disaster events. So overall, the physical wave modeling had a positive outcome. We're able to understand which designs we're able to use, which designs we're not able to use. Are there areas that we can define or redefine or change to better increase the performance of these designs, as well as lower down the budgets of the construction. So this is just one example of how we use the risk assessment to see how our future investments and how constructing these infrastructures can help us better understand our risk and vulnerabilities. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James, for this presentation. So we went from a national view of risk reduction and adaptation efforts in Fiji right into a project. It's a pity we're not all in one room, because I'm sure that some of the engineers in this room would want to have a discussion with you, James, but it's really very interesting how risk information informed the design of these protective structures, and now it also allowed you actually testing the performance of the designs in different scenarios. So thank you so much. I'm going straight to the next presenter, and that will be Philomena. She'll be talking about the value of risk information in national adaptation planning. Philomena, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that introduction. Appreciate that. So the focus of my talk is the use of risk information and data for adaptation planning in the Pacific. I'm just going to provide you with an overview at the regional level of what these needs are and how they are used, and what are some of the challenges and also opportunities to address some of the challenges that we have faced in terms of a number of issues in relation to that. In terms of adaptation planning process, it's an iterative process that is forward-looking, and its purpose is to look into how do you or how do countries adapt, you know, in the medium and the long term. What are those adaptation needs are? How are you going to implement it from now up to the end of that implementation period? It can be done at national level, subnational, provincial or sectoral level, as well as community level. Now, adaptation planning or any planning is not a new process to the region. There are numerous existing processes that countries are using, and it's different from country to country. So what information and data that we need in terms of adaptation planning, and how that information or data is used. In terms of needs, we need climate data in terms of temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, ocean conditions, including sea surface temperature, and so forth. We also need risk and vulnerability data and information in terms of who and what is at risk and when that will happen. Also environmental and spatial information and data, census, economic and social information and data, as well as including, as well as cultural and heritage related information, because traditional and indigenous knowledge and cultural practices is also very important to, you know, adapting to the impacts of climate change. And how is that data and information is used in adaptation planning? Climate data is actually used in the climate change risk and vulnerability assessment, because without that, the assessment itself is incomplete. The climate change risk and vulnerability assessment findings are then used to inform discussions amongst community members, among, with government and civil societies and private sector and all the other relevant stakeholders to look into what are some of the adaptation options to address the risks and the vulnerabilities that have been identified as part of that risk and vulnerability assessment. The information and data can also be used to get political buy-in or buy-in from the different levels of government, whether it's technical, operational, or even at the community level, because, most of the time we hear a lot of the technical terms are used and our people in the communities do not understand what it means. So the use of that information is very important, but at some point it needs to be translated into language that would make it easier for everybody to understand what it means and what are the implications. It is also used in stakeholder engagement. I think I've just mentioned about using that to get that buy-in. It is also used in communication and advocacy in the adaptation and the climate change space in general. It is also used to identify what are the capacity building needs, what are the skill sets and the knowledge that government officials or even people in the civil society or communities or even the private sector would need to plan and implement adaptation to adapt to the impacts of climate change. The other most important thing is that is also used to inform the climate rationale of any project proposal to the Green Climate Fund, or to the Adaptation Fund, or even to ADB, for example, because that climate rationale justify why countries or any organization is trying to access these funds to support implementation of adaptation in the region. In terms of challenges, one of the key ones is the availability of climate data, but it's not just about the availability of that data, it's also about the quality. And the quality depends on a number of things. And one of those is the observation networks, the equipment that are being used to collect the climate data. And that's important. And it's one of the things that SPREP is working on, with our funding from EU to look into the observation equipment that are deployed across the different Pacific countries and see where we can support, replacing some of those equipment to help improve the quality of the data that is collected by those observation equipment. Access to data and information is also important, and it's a key challenge, but I guess it comes down to your understanding the requirements of the countries in order for you to access that data and information. Technical capacity and capability, it's one of the key challenges in the region. Technical capacity in terms to analyze and interpret what that data is saying, or the trend, and also to the use of that analyzed data to produce information to inform decision. That's important because you can't just, use the raw data that comes out from the observation or a rainfall network, for instance. That data has to be analyzed. You need to see the trend. It needs to be compared to historical data as well to see how things have changed up to now and how it might change going into the future, and how that would then help shape the adaptation solutions that, or rather how what that means in the context of risk and exposure and vulnerability, and how that then would change adaptation responses. Implementation of decisions from that is important as well. In terms of opportunities to help address the challenges that I've talked about, from SPREP experience, we use the relationship with our member states to access data and information, because they actually belong to the countries. They don't belong to SPREP, but SPREP needs to understand the rules. How do you access that? Because, you have to have a letter of agreement or an agreement with that particular country, even if a third party, you're engaging a third party to use that to produce something that you are after. You have to make sure that the third party itself also respect the requirements of the country. Using partnerships with scientific and research organizations, we have a number of partners in the space, in the science and research space, such as NUA is one of that partner, and CSIRO. Hi, Doug, good to see you online. Also, one other key thing that we are doing is embedding in projects and program initiatives to get some financial support to help enhance data and information quality, to help with accessing that data, to help with the management of that data or that information, to ensure that there is continuity of access and use and application. Thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you so much, Philomena. I think, you know, of the many points that you've made, I think one of the key ones is actually the transition from the risk information, translating that into concepts that can actually be understood, into information that can be understood, and then also applying that to a range and discussion of adaptation options. That there is no automatism between identifying the level of risk and the necessary solutions. There's dialogue that needs to be happen, that needs to be broad-based. So thanks so much for raising that. This is actually an excellent introduction for our next speaker. And this is Rebecca Tavionich, because Rebecca joins us from the private sector, and the private sector is not always part of these types of discussions. And she's gonna give us some, you know, concrete examples of how the private sector, what kind of situations the private sector, in her case, in the Cook Islands, needs to deal with, and how risk information may help in the future to deal and cope with these situations. So Rebecca, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Alexandra. Kia ora, everyone. It's great to hear from all the previous speakers around a lot of the planning activities. I especially like all the risk and vulnerability data that helps going into that. What I'm going to speak about over the next 5 minutes is an event that occurred in the Cook Islands no less than a month ago. I'm going to speak through the event itself, the impact that it had, with particular focus on businesses, and how our country went about responding to the event. So not necessarily on the planning side. So let's just assume, for the purpose of this speech that I'm giving today, that all planning activities were done. So on the 12th of July, 2022, so not too long ago, a number of homes, properties, and businesses in the Cook Islands were severely damaged after king tides large parts of our country. The main island of Rarotonga saw several residents, businesses, and experienced flash flooding and catastrophic damage to like properties due to this unusual weather event. Fortunately, there were no loss of life reported. King tides is not a new phenomenon. They are forecasted events that bring with them high water levels and can cause some local tidal flooding. But over time, sea level rise is raising the height of tidal systems and encroaching further and further inland. However, on the day of this particular event, the naturally occurring king tide coincided with a high pressure system from neighboring country New Zealand that made its way through to the Cook Islands. This high pressure system paired with the king tide event saw waves of up to 5 meters thrash the southwest coast of Rarotonga with a ferocity and strength that moved coastal boulders, debris, and destroyed established structures and buildings in its path. This continued for 4 days. The extent of the damage included a motor vehicle that was uplifted from its parked spot and plummeted into a nearby restaurant, completely destroying the building wall and structure at the point of impact. Multiple accommodators with beachfront properties experienced damages that rendered their rooms or their villas unsafe, completely waterlogged or covered in displaced sand, some having to demolish and remove what remained in order to rebuild from scratch. Now, with the majority of tourism accommodators situated within 140 meters of the coast in Rarotonga, this event had crippling impact to the private sector. The extent of the damages incurred in this type of disaster event is not unique to the Cook Islands. However, I will share our country's response with particular focus on how the Chamber supported impacted businesses to swiftly recover from this disaster. Our first priority was understanding the extent of the damage we experienced. With approximately 85% of our country's GDP derived from tourism, a tourism impact assessment survey was launched within 24 hours of the event occurring. Its objective was to quantify the damage and financial impact to the country. The survey collated information from businesses on the extent of structural damage, capital damage, visitor displacement, timeframe to return to business as usual, insurance coverage, and loss of income. Quantifying the direct impact of the event enabled us to swiftly prioritize business needs. In this instance, access to financial support where private insurance funds were not yet available. Through conversations with the Chamber and the Cook Islands government, the government made available small grant payments withdrew from a contingency fund maintained by our Ministry of Finance. Completion of the survey sped up payments where they were eligible, which saw a positive result on the timeframe to return to business as usual. In addition to this, managing the messaging internationally was key. News of the disaster spread across the Pacific, with coverage and images of the damages shown in several neighboring countries. As a result, some tourists were proactively rescheduling flights, and cancelling their accommodation in areas that were unaffected. Collectively, the Chamber of Commerce, alongside other key stakeholders within the country, across private and public sector, formulated key media messaging to manage the impact of social media news where possible. In this instance, our private sector businesses benefited from the strong relationship that we have with other NGOs, the community, and the Cook Islands government, and public agencies as a whole. Individually, it would have been time-consuming and potentially futile for businesses to seek support one-on-one. However, by collating mass data on the overall impact of the country, all support agencies were armed with the right details to make informed decisions. Risk assessment will always better serve the commercial sector. Currently, there is no risk mapping of income-generating infrastructure situated in high-risk areas for the Cook Islands. Risk associating to climate events is recorded based on potential physical damage without any correlation to loss of income, revenue as a result. Whilst this may be a difficult task to undertake, as evidenced in the survey that our country undertook no less than a month ago, the data that it produced will only enable swift decisions and swift calls to action by those in a position to help. What everyone understood as a result of this event is that key planning individually is key, but collectively, especially in the private sector, when we're all going through the same event and facing the same type of conundrums around everyone trying to get the same excavator or building team to come through and do the repairs collectively, there are a lot of efficiencies gained. And to drill the point around tourism making up 85% of our GDP within our country, return to business is key so that we can continue to produce revenue for our country and continue to fuel the public services, purse strings, as well as the services for our tourists as they come into the island, and as well as keeping our country as a whole safe. So that's all from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Excellent presentation, great example of recent events, of the types of events of which unfortunately the Pacific sees more. And this is closely related to climate change. So I think one of the key points, of course, that you made in terms of the risk information is that currently often risk assessments don't really look at the losses in, as you said, the income generating sectors of a country. And in the case of the Cook Islands, but not only the Cook Islands, of course, the tourism plays a big role. We had an interesting discussion before talking also about exposure issues related to tourism, beach resorts, etc. So I'm sure that in some of the working groups, there will be an interesting discussion of this. I believe, but I'm looking at our training professionals, we have something like 5 minutes left for questions and answers.
Yes, we do.
Could I ask Doug to ask the question that he left in the chat box?
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you to all the participants. That was a fantastic kind of overview. I guess my question, if I may, to the permanent secretary. I mean, given the levels of development that's happened over the last two or three kind of generations, some in very highly kind of exposed areas, relocation is always a difficult topic to talk about, but it is going to be kind of an important element of risk reduction adaptation going forward. Now, Fiji probably has one of the most kind of proactive approaches to helping kind of communities relocate from very highly exposed areas. Would you be able to kind of comment, maybe perhaps on the kind of information that you use and you know, kind of what are some of the lessons learned from this approach for relocating kind of highly exposed communities?
Thank you, Doug. I mean, that's a very important question. Also, it runs at the core of our disaster space, and mitigation space. It's a big. In fact, the planned relocation guideline we did develop in 2017. It basically provides also. Basically a toolbox to get information on the ground, how do interagency operate, and how decisions are escalated up to cabinet level. Relocation guideline, at the core of the guideline is the communities themselves. Those who are going to be relocated is to for agencies or the key agencies that are driving relocation implementation, understand what are the before the impact data, and as well as in the after movement, when after the relocation, what are the new space that are allocated to them, basically. Because they are moving from their burial sites, they are moving from their churches, they are moving from their. Sometimes they move partially over time. So it's a very complex exercise, and a very costly. In fact, we've done one relocation 5 years ago. It was completed, but since that has passed. I mean, in the western side, we still need to deal with land boundaries, disputes on new families that move into the new sites. They want to expand the boundaries. These are the practical issues that come after the relocation. So I guess. One key lesson that I think Fiji learned from relocating communities is to reach out to each and every individual present in the community, including young and old. Because even after 10 years of relocation, these young children or the young adult will become a leader in the community. He needs to understand what are the leaders committing 10 years before. Sometimes it creates disputes, but I think those that have moved smoothly, I think are the ones that we engage better with them, we plan together. And it is a decision at the community level, mostly funded by government, but driven at the community and supported with our partners, with development partners. I think that's one key lesson from us, Doug. Thank you.
Vinaka Vakalivu, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we've had such a great panel discussion, and it's been so engaging. I think because of time at this point, and I don't see further questions in the chat box, there will be more opportunities to discuss these topics in the groups. I would like to introduce a discussant, one of our participants, who's going to talk about the experience that Tonga has had in terms of generating, but then also thinking about and using risk information. Her name is Celia Leguer. She is the Executive Liaison Officer of the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources in Tonga. Celia is an urban and regional development planner. She has been working with the government of Tonga since 2010 on various issues, including urban planning, environmental management, and adaptation. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the Dortmund University, as well as the University of Philippines. Celia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. Malolele, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to share my knowledge and thoughts on the application of disaster risk information in Tonga. In 2020, I was very fortunate to work alongside ADB experts and others, together with many ministries in the government of Tonga and other stakeholders, to support two strands of work. And the first one is the development of procedures to strengthen post-disaster public finance management, as well as the multi-hazard disaster risk assessment of Tongatapu. Now, in my sharing, I will briefly share three uses amongst many others that I've learned during these assignments. The first one, Tonga Power Limited is a public enterprise that looks after electricity throughout the whole of Tonga. And during the multi-hazard disaster risk assessment, Tonga Power Limited shared their development of a business continuity management system, which includes risk management programs and mitigating risk controls. With this framework, I've seen constant upgrading works by Tonga Power to their assets throughout Tonga, and witnessed improvements in their services recently. For example, in recent disasters, I think Tonga have experienced lesser and lesser days of power outrage, and I do believe that these were results of these mitigating risk control activities that from the continuity management plan of TBL. Now, the second application that I've learned during this assignment was regarding the public finance. Tonga has a national emergency fund that is made available for before and also during and after disasters. And although there are many procedures involved with the management and the use of this fund, there was one particular task within this assignment was the development of a framework agreements for predetermined goods, services, and works that were anticipated to contribute hugely an improvement for Tonga's current emergency procurement, and therefore should support rapid delivery of support and quality of spending. Emergency procurement was one of the many issues that the stakeholders in Tonga mentioned that they were finding a bit difficult and that take a longer time during and after disaster. So the drafting of this framework agreements surely anticipate improvement in the emergency procurement for Tonga. The last uses and application of risk information in Tonga is the spatial, or also known or sometimes known as the land use planning. And although this has already taken place in Tonga, such as, for example, the planning and the actual relocation of affected population and villages to safer or higher ground in Tonga, I believe that this is an area that that still needs a lot more focus and works, and it should improve Tonga's resilience in the future. Thank you, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you so much, Celia, for these reflections and making the linkages really between risk information and preparedness in terms of managing the continuity of services, of infrastructure in this case, energy, looking at public financial management and contingency reserves, and defining, the funds size in relation to the more frequent hazards that could be addressed from national resources, as well as finally talking about, and we've heard this before, the challenge of addressing land use planning, addressing some of the recent recovery needs as well in terms of relocating islanders displaced by the volcanic eruption. It's time now for group work, and I am handing back to Cal.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that, Alexandra. So here is where we are in our agenda. We've heard from the panel, we've done some reflections, and now we'd like to do some breakout discussions on where some of your different countries are in terms of collecting and making use of risk information. Now, here's how we're going to be doing this. We're going to break out into 3 different groups, and we'll have facilitators for each of those groups. So those facilitators will be myself, we'll have Alexandra, and we'll also have Stuart, who you heard from in the last session. We'll each be facilitating these groups. And what we'll be doing is we'll be mapping a little bit about where countries stand in terms of risk information, and also, what are some of the interests, what are some of the opportunities in each of our countries. And so we have 4 questions that we're going to be looking at in this discussion. One is relevant. So in what way is risk information relevant to your work? So for example, are you designing intervention measures or something else perhaps, right? The second one is opportunities. So what opportunities are there to apply risk information in your work or in your country? The third one is challenges. So what challenges are there to applying risk information in your work? And then the last one is types. So what types of risk information do you think is most valuable to your project or your organization? So these are the 4 things that we're looking to discuss. We are going to do a bit of a sharing, and then we'll ask if someone in the room is able to share back to the rest of the group. We're going to do a bit of a share out. We're reporting back after this, so we can have the opportunity to hear from each of the groups. But what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be heading into breakouts. We will have a discussion where we're looking to hear from everyone around your thoughts around these 4 questions. We want to map out your responses, and then we'd like to do a little bit of a share out to hear what is coming out from each of the rooms afterwards. We've got 17 minutes to do this, and as I said, this will be facilitated. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and open up the breakouts and start these discussions. So let's go ahead and head to breakouts. Okay, welcome back, everyone. And thanks for those really great discussions. I can say for sure that I learned a few things as part of those discussions. And we're going to hear from each of the breakout groups just to get a sense of what came out from the different rooms. As we do this, what I'll do is I'll bring up the mural board, the Jamboard where the notes were being taken. Let me just share our first one here. I'm going to bring up this board where you'll get to see some of the notes that came out from each of these sessions. Now, just as we were closing, there was a bit of a debate going on about who might share from this first session, which I helped facilitate. And I think we were talking about Doug potentially sharing. But Doug, if you're not, if you'd rather not, I can go ahead and share in your place. But Doug, would you like to share?
I'm quite happy sharing. I find it kind of ironic that the person with the most incomprehensible Scottish accent gets the job of feeding back, but never mind. Hopefully I don't talk too fast. So I guess couple of key points on relevance. Basically, risk information is relevant for everything we do, from kind of the large kind of scale, kind of looking at how we communicate with the world, kind of in terms of kind of undersea cables and airports and things like that. It's also kind of relevant at a whole range of different time scales, from kind of the 2 to 3 day kind of response kind of time scales for kind of municipal councils cleaning up, or preparing to clean up in the aftermath of a kind of a large cyclone or similar event, to much more longer time scales for infrastructure, in development planning and things like that. Opportunities. I guess it gives us the opportunity to bring together different stakeholders, and I think the Permanent Secretary mentioned that very well in his in his comments around some of the relocation aspect, about how they were using the process to bring together different government departments with the communities, all with a vested interest in that. And there was examples from Samoa as well around their impact forecasting system there, that's bringing together kind of the NDMO, kind of the Met Service and the Water Resource Division to better inform kind of emergency response and things like that. The planning for kind of availability of resources and things like that, to a now better kind of preparation before events actually happen. Kind of there's work beginning in Fiji on that, and I know they've put considerable effort into that. But again, a large opportunity for better preparation in the kind of prior to cyclone season or prior to events happening, so that effective response can happen. The types of information, obviously, kind of everything from kind of spatial and social and economic information. I guess some of the things we talked about was that risk assessment is still quite an economic and still quite a quantitative kind of art, shall we say, and that kind of improving the ways that we can incorporate kind of social cultural kind of information into that process is a need. And then some of the challenges. Sorry, Cal, just move over. That feeds into some of the challenges as well. I guess some of the other challenges is, again, it's quite a linear approach. We think about the hazard, we think about the assets that are exposed to that hazard, we develop kind of risk information. We maybe don't kind of think enough about how we're actually going to use this information and the way to present this information, and how to incorporate it into the relevant decision-making processes that are already in place in different government departments and things like that. Sorry, team, was there anything else that I've missed?
Looking good. Well, thank you very much, Doug, and thank you so much to the rest of the team for helping develop this discussion and for sharing. We're going to head over to our second group. Stu, who might be sharing for this group?
I was going to share this. Upwards to this board, so I'll be quick, conscious of time. So we talked about the risk information being relevant to supporting risk management systems, measuring, comparing damage and losses, understanding where the key impacts could be, and obviously then preparing investments, activities, measures to reduce those damages and losses. And we had Manu from the Samoan Met Department also describing input of risk information around weather forecasting and looking at the impacts of multi-hazard disasters for planning. Lots of different opportunities to apply risk information, amending land tenure system based on risks that are faced, opportunity to look at the impacts of past events or experience and feed that into improved planning and infrastructure investment in the future. In the context of the COVID pandemic, looking at building resilience post-COVID and providing recovery support there. And in terms of the types of risk information, we spoke about spatial data and aligned with some of the challenges. Some of the challenges in using and understanding spatial information seem to be abating as younger people come into the system who are more familiar with technology and spatial information and able to perhaps more readily integrate that. There's perhaps some opportunities to innovate on the types of risk information and the connections that can be made between risk information and other types of natural environment information or perhaps social information to improve decision making. The challenges, I think, are ones that we've heard before. Struggle with dedicated capacity for developing and applying risk information, a lack of easy or good access to existing information. So, for example, Jutta spoke about performing needs assessments and damage and loss assessments, but having to build from scratch, not being able to very easily find information in a short-term project. So that's something to be addressed, and then lacking resources within agencies perhaps to get involved in risk assessment or apply them. One thing that was mentioned and is also familiar is that the fact that this international consultants applying their expertise and their models, and then perhaps not providing a sustainable way forward for agencies and departments within country to carry on using those models. So I think that covers what's on the board. And if anybody else has a burning point from our team, please shout quickly. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Stu, and thanks to the entire group. For our third group, we have Anne who will be sharing. So go ahead, Anne.
Okay, so as you can see from our learning session, a lot of the risk information that was relevant to their work was relating to communities. So it was the projects that were done either in the capacity of construction or data collection. So a lot of the work really involves a lot of data gathering and also translating this data so that it would be easily accessible by the communities and also by the private sector. So that's how risk information was relevant to their work. Opportunities that were found, I'd like to highlight something that I really found interesting was this mentioned by James, by the Marshall Islands, about a sense of ownership, about, you know, since risk information was communicated, people will then have a sense of ownership on the projects and what's happening with the country. I think that was a really excellent point about risk information opportunities. But a lot of the opportunities also is about working together with partners and the communities themselves. Another thing mentioned was the inclusion of, or the expansion of risk, the definition of risk, I guess, especially in the insurance, since not all risks are covered by insurance. So moving on to risks, can we zoom into the risks? One risk that was mentioned was actually communicating complex terminologies, especially when it comes to scientific terms, to the communities, and also the processes involved in creating these projects. And finally, types of risk information that's valuable are actually the data sets. So the Philippines mentioned a lot of terminologies and the specific data sets that they use in their projects. So that's a summary of our discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Anne. And thanks very much also to the group. who helped put this together. And so that was our three groups. So congratulations. Great discussions as far as I could see. What I'd like to do is I'd like to pass things over to Alexandra to help us wrap up for today. So Alexandra, we're nearing the end of our session. What are some of the key takeaways and what might we be looking forward to next?
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Great session. Thank you so much, everybody, to the panelists, and then also the lively group discussions that we just heard back from in the report. So for me, the main takeaway really of the session is, I think there's no doubt, there is no discussion amongst the participants about applying risk information is a must. It's not, something that there's any doubt about. And it almost applies to every sector and every specialty represented in this group that we can think of. I think the big discussion and maybe the missing link, and that's been pointed out, are two: between generating risk information and applying, there is communicating the risk in a language and with units, with metrics that are relevant to the people who need to act on these risks, who need to take decisions, or who are themselves concerned directly in their lives and in their livelihoods by having to change, having to relocate, etc. So communication dissemination, I think again we heard how crucial this is. The second is the cultural dimensions, both of risk, of understanding risk, but then also of adaptation. And another important issue in relation to this, in order to help this along, to help risk information being applied to adaptation planning or to development, is capacity building, again, has been referred to several times. So I think those I would say are the main takeaways. We've had, of course, very interesting also suggestions in terms of, please don't just focus on the assets, don't just focus on the hardware, so to speak. When you look at risk, please also look at the indirect consequences on the economic sector, on people, on etc. So that's another kind of demand that was coming out of the group. I think we've had actually through this discussion, it's a good segue to the next session, and where we will be talking about some of the issues that have been raised today. So it's about working together to develop risk information, including community perspectives, both on risk and then on acting on risk, using that risk information. And for that, we'll be seeing each other again in 2 weeks. So on August the 25th, same time, same place, so to speak. And we're really looking forward to having you. Thanks so much again for your time. I know we're over time, and I'll get some feedback soon from our training professionals, because it's probably my fault. So yeah, see you then, and all the best.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.